The Mount-to-Coast S1 and the Mount-to-Coast R1, a trainer and a racer intended for ultra running distances that do share a lot of overlap, but how do you choose which one is right for you? Admittedly, when you see a trainer and a racer, it doesn't seem like there should be a lot of overlap, but actually between these two shoes, there is quite a bit of overlap, and it really comes down to what you're trying to accomplish, which one's going to be right for you. Now, I've already done initial impressions of the S1 and the R1 and the R1R, which is an alternative model to this shoe, and I'll put a link in the description to both of those. And also, Mount-to-Coast has sent both of these shoes for the purpose of review, but they're not paying me to make this review, nor do they have any editorial control over this video. And with that out of the way, let's jump into talking about these two shoes. And as always with my Versus videos, let's start with the specs. Now, when you look at the specs of these two shoes, you see that there's a lot of similarities, but there's some subtle differences between them that really distinguish them to be individual. And the first is in the drop. In the S1, you have a 10 mil drop. And I will say that you do feel 8 to 10 mil in that. You do have a higher heel in that shoe. In the R1 and the R1R, which are just variations of essentially the same shoe, just outsole differences, you have an 8 mil drop, and I will say that feels 6 to 8, probably a little bit closer to 8. The second thing is the weight. Now, the S1 is a trainer. You would expect it to be a little bit more overbuilt, a little heavier, and it is. And you do notice that on foot, where the R1 and the R1R are race shoes, so they are lighter, and you do notice that, especially in the R1, which is the lightest of the three shoes in this video. But otherwise, the technologies in the midsoles, the light cell foam, which is the brand's in-house supercritical PIBA blend foam, are the same. However, they're tuned slightly differently. The tuning of the light cell foam in the S1 is a little firmer, a little bit more durable, a little less resilient. And the tuning in the R1 is a little bit more resilient, a little bit more airy, I would say. Though when you hear supercritical PIBA blend foam, don't compare either one of these shoes, especially the R1 or the R1R, to a marathon super shoe, because they're not tuned the same way. These are shoes intended for very, very long distances, and they're tuned extremely differently. Looking inside the midsole, both these shoes have the same technology on board, as you can see here. Both have the brand's zero sag insert, which is a urethane insert meant to provide more density to the foam, less sag, less compression, but still giving a very soft ride from the supercritical PIBA foam. In the R1 and the R1R, you see the zero sag element in the forefoot, but there's also a secondary zero sag element in the heel, where in the S1 you have a TPU heel clip in the heel that gives the stability. But both of these shoes have that same light cell foam with the zero sag technology to make sure that you're not packing the foam out over ultra long distances. And looking at the midsole geometry, both these shoes have the brand's GoFlow geometry, which is a geometry built to provide a very smooth heel-to-toe transition. And if you're a heel striker, midfoot striker, or forefoot striker, you're going to get benefits of that. Now, the R1 has slightly more toe rocker. However, it's not extreme. In either one of these shoes, you're never going to get that falling off a cliff or falling forward feeling that you do in a lot of more aggressive marathon purpose super shoes. But you are being propelled forward. These, again, are shoes intended for very long distances, and this GoFlow geometry really smoothly propels you forward step after step. And if you package all of that together, the light cell foam, all the technology in the midsole, and the geometry in the S1, I would call that a very smooth ride. Now, as I said, the light cell foam is tuned a little bit firmer. It's a training shoe, so you don't get a lot of sink, but you do get a little energy return in that. Not an extreme amount, but enough for a training application. And in the R1 and the R1R, I would consider that more of an airy feel. The foam, again, is tuned a little bit softer. It's a little bit lighter weight, and you definitely get a little bit more sink, and you get a little bit more energy return. However, as a race shoe, this is not tuned anywhere near a marathon super shoe. It's much less aggressive. The foam is much less all over the place. Again, both of these shoes are intended for long distances, ultra long distance running. Moving to the outsole of these three shoes, this is really where the biggest differences are. The S1 and the R1R have the same rubber outsole, where the R1 has a CPU outsole, which is a cast polyurethane outsole, which provides better abrasion and wear resistance and temperature resistance. But the S1 and the R1 provide a very protective ride. The R1 gives you a very feel-based compliant ride to the ground. But from a geometry standpoint, there's a lot of similarities here. The waist of the S1 is slightly narrower. The forefoot of the R1 and the R1R is slightly wider. But all three of these shoes give a very stable, very smooth, very comfortable ride for, again, long distance running. Moving to the upper and fit of both these shoes, I'm going to say they fit my foot identically. I actually think they're the same last. Now, both these shoes are US men's size 9, and they both fit me true to size. The only real difference in fit, I'm going to say the midfoot in the S1 is slightly narrower than the R1. But we're talking a millimeter or two, but this definitely has a tighter fit in the midfoot. But otherwise, the fit is identical. The upper material for both these shoes, again, I think is the same. It's a dual-layer jacquard mesh. However, the weave of it is a little different here. There's a little less cutouts, and the overlays are actually on top of it, whereas in the R1, they're actually internal to the shoe. So the toe bumper you can see in the S1, the toe bumper in the R1 is internal. Now, the other big difference between these two shoes is in the eyelet chain. In the S1, we have a traditional eyelet chain with a traditional lacing system. In the R1, we have what the brand calls their Tune Fit dual lacing system. And what this is actually dividing the upper into two zones. There's a heel zone and a forefoot zone. And the eyelet chain is tensioned differently. In the heel zone, the upper part of the eyelet chain, we have a traditional lacing system, and in the bottom part of the eyelet chain, in the forefoot section, you have what I would call a speed lace. And this allows you to tension the different parts of the shoe differently. Now again, this is a shoe intended for ultra long distance running. You're on your feet 20, 30 hours over a long race, or maybe 10, 20 hours a day over stage races over multiple days. Your feet are going to swell. So having the ability to tension the shoe differently in the two different zones in the shoe is really an interesting engineering solution to that problem for ultra long distance racing. But otherwise, again, the fit of both these is very precise. I think from a width standpoint in the forefoot, it's very similar. And from a toe box standpoint, I have very similar feel. I have very sensitive big toes and big toe toenail issues. Neither one of these shoes give me any problem in that area, and the fit overall is very good. Now, moving on to the ride of these two shoes, and starting with the S1, this I describe as a very smooth, almost very neutral ride. This is what I would expect a PIBA-based trainer to feel like. There's no extremeness from the PIBA foam. It's not trying to spring you everywhere. It's just providing you that sort of very soft, cushioned PIBA feel. But again, it's not trying to spring you forward with every step. This is a trainer. This is a trainer meant for very long training runs. And I think it does it beautifully. It uses the brand's GoFlow geometry, which I've already talked about. But again, this shoe has a very smooth, again, almost very neutral toe off. There isn't a lot of rocker in the forefoot of the shoe, but again, it really sort of propels you forward in a very smooth way. I think for long training runs, this slightly denser, slightly heavier shoe is going to work exceptionally well. Moving to the R1, I would describe the ride of this, as I said, very airy. The supercritical PIBA foam, or the light cell foam in this shoe, definitely feels lighter, and it's tuned a little bit softer. You get more pronounced sink in this shoe, though the zero sag technology is a little bit more present. It's giving the shoe a little bit more density in the midsole, a density that it really shouldn't have for a foam that's this airy. And the GoFlow geometry in this midsole works really well. Now, there is a little bit more, slightly more toe rocker in this shoe, and this shoe is a little bit more energetic off the toe, but again, compared to a marathon racing super shoe, it is not extreme. This is a shoe intended for very long distance racing. It's going to protect your feet, it's going to give you some feel, and it's going to work really well for those very long courses and long distance racing. Another way of explaining the difference between these three shoes is to put them on my performance matrix. Now, starting with the S1, I think the sweet spot for the S1 is really here. And again, the red or orange area is really, I think, where the shoe is happiest. Now, the S1 likes to go easy. It will go into steady, but once you get into the faster end of steady, I think the shoe just doesn't want to be there. It really is happiest for easy running. Now, Mount to Coast said they designed the shoe for paces of 5 to 9 minutes per kilometer or 8 to 14 minutes per mile. Again, the pacing in ultra long distance racing and training is very different than 5K to marathon road racing. So that actually makes sense. And those are the paces that I found the shoe happiest in my easy range. Now, if we put the R1 on here, This shoe has considerably more range because it is a more airy foam. You have better compliance because of the lighter outsole in the shoe. This is a race shoe, but again, don't think of it as the same as a marathon super shoe. It is intended for paces of 4 to 8 minutes per kilometer or 6 to 13 minutes per mile. But it does have more range. As you can see, the sweet spot of the R1 is really in that steady to threshold, but it will go into max effort. It is a shoe you can pick up the pace and accelerate in, again, because of the more compliant outsole and the airiness of the midsole foam. It will do that well, and it's actually kind of a surprise when you pick up the pace in it. And that's what you would expect from a race shoe. However, it doesn't want to sit in that max effort range and doesn't even really want to be in that threshold range, which again, a shoe designed for ultra long distance racing, that makes sense. You want to be in that steady range, and that's really the sweet spot of the R1. If we put the R1R on here, which again is the same shoe as the R1, it just has a rubber outsole, the same outsole as the S1, I think the range is a little bit shorter. It still wants to be in steady to the edge of threshold, but I don't think it has quite the same legs to really pick up the pace and get into that max effort, just because of the added stiffness and weight of the rubber outsole. But again, it has its own applications, and it will cover most of the same range and be happiest in that steady pace. The way I conceptualize the Mount to Coast running offerings is this. In the middle, you have the S1. That is their neutral training option. Now, the brand recently launched their P1, which is their stable training option. It's not a shoe I've run, and it's probably not a shoe I'm going to cover because I don't need a stability shoe. But the P1 has, again, a very interesting approach to what a stability shoe is. I'll put a link in the description to a video that explains how they concepted that shoe. It's quite interesting. But between the two training options, neutral and stable, they have pretty much everything covered. Now, when you look at the race shoes, to me, you have two options based on feel. The first one is the R1. That's the feel racer, the one that you get a lot of ground feel, has a very compliant feel to the ground because of that lighter outsole. It's the one you can pick up the pace in, and that to me is the faster race option. And in the R1R, you have what I would call the protective feel because of the rubber outsole in that shoe. Otherwise, it's the identical shoe to the R1. It just has a rubber outsole. You get a little bit stiffer, much more protective feel. So if you're running on less good pavement, you need a shoe that you're going to sit back and cruise a little bit more, but still in a race environment. I think that's where the R1R comes in. And I think it's really interesting how the brand is providing not only training options, but also very key racing options for these types of distances. So what's the verdict here? Which of these three shoes do I like the best? Well, it really comes down to what I'm trying to accomplish. Now, I'm not an ultra distance runner. I'm at best a marathoner. Even right now, I'm focusing on shorter distances. But let's say as a all-around runner, someone who maybe runs the occasional half marathon to marathon, and you're looking for a good training option, just a good, steady, long-run shoe, I would actually recommend the S1. I think this is probably the best all-around trainer that you can get from Mount to Coast. It will just do everything you need it to do, and it'll do it very well. So for just all-around general running, more on the easy side, but if you're looking for a cushion and protective shoe, go for the S1. Now, I'm a marathoner, so what if I'm going into a marathon build and I'm looking for a shoe for most of my easy long runs, the LSD type runs, but in a marathon build, you're going to be doing some pace. You're going to need to pick it up and get into your marathon pace. Well, for that, I am going to pick the R1 because this is the slightly more racier option. This is a shoe I'd feel comfortable picking up the pace for the most part to get into my marathon pace. But for the real key workouts in the build, I'm going to use my marathon racing super shoe for that. But for everything else in the build, this is that long distance trainer that I'm going to do because I know I can pick up the pace and I'm getting a slightly racier package. So it's the best combination of trainer and racer in a long run cushion shoe. Let's say I'm doing that marathon build in a less urban area where I'm going to be running on dirt roads, something like Magnolia Road in Boulder, which is a dirt road where you do a lot of marathon training if you're in the Boulder area. What shoe am I going to pick? Well, I'm going to pick the R1R for that because the rubber outsole on the shoe is going to be much more protective for that varied surface running. The R1 will be able to handle it, but I just think this shoe is going to be better for less paved surfaces. So if you're doing a lot of your marathon build training on softer surfaces, mostly dirt roads, maybe light trail, gravel roads, that sort of thing, I would definitely go with the R1R because you're going to get a much more protective package, but you're still getting the airy foam and the performance of the R1 just with a little bit more protection. So again, the best of everything in this shoe. Overall, I'm a big fan of Mount to Coast. I think they're putting some really interesting products into the marketplace. They are very niche and they're focused on ultra road racing. However, as I pointed out in this video, I think any runner, from an easy runner looking for a good long run trainer to someone who's racing marathons, looking for that long run trainer in the marathon build, are going to do very well with any of the products that Mount to Coast makes. Now, the brand has provided me a couple links to their store if you want to pick up a pair of any one of these 3 shoes. These are not affiliate links. I don't get anything in return for you using them, but it just lets the brand know where you came from, that you came from Sagasu Running, and I appreciate that. Now, I want to thank Mount to Coast for sending these shoes over. I've really enjoyed testing and running on all of these, much more than I expected to, and I look forward to trying out more products in the future. Thank you for making it to the end of the video. If you find this content useful, consider subscribing. You'll see more content from me pop up in your feed. If not, drop a like on this video because it helps this channel continue to grow, which I always appreciate. And with that, I'll catch you in the next one.